she took her own life. And that was just a huge shock. It was a huge shock to me, and did put into stark relief the fact that this kind of, general malaise that I felt wasn't just something I could do for the rest of my life. It was sort of like, okay, all that stuff you say you're going to do later, some days, for some people, there is no later.
And so since then, you've written this book and you've started, pushing forward this idea of #RunFree. For people here who haven't yet had the pleasure of reading your book, could you sort of outline what the main takeaways are from it?
So Run Free was the TED Talk, and to be fair, that was something I did when I decided to leave full-time work at Financial Times and go to more of a portfolio career and be more entrepreneurial, and try to spend less time on a plane and more time prioritizing the things that were important to me. So somebody said, oh, you seem to be at a crossroads, that's their theme, you should do a TED Talk. And I really wanted to, I said to myself, what do I want to do? Like, I don't, right? We're always going, I know it's not this, but what is it? And I decided I wanted to write and I wanted to tell stories. And so I kind of thought, okay, I'll do this, I'll do this open mic audition, and then talked a bit about this transition and ended up doing the talk. And it was a lot more work and a lot more personal exposure than I'd ever anticipated doing. But it did launch me to a completely different track. And then a couple of years after that, I've written this book called Future Proof, which is a combination of the theme of living life really on your own terms, not on other people's terms, combined with an interest I have in the future of work, because I think as things that speed up and work changes, this idea that you can have this, do everything right and come out ahead is more impossible than ever. And I will say that you and I have talked a little bit about, how much vulnerability people have. But one of the things that really shocked me when I did my TED Talk was I was on the board at the American Chamber, and just with a lot of people who are super buttoned down. And I was like, okay, here we go, career suicide right here, midlife crisis on stage. And the biggest blessing from that has been the conversations that I've had with people, including people I've known for a long time in Hong Kong, and how open they have been with their own struggles and their own lives in ways that was really, I feel grateful for.
I mean, there definitely has been a shift. A lot of high-flying people have started coming out, talking more openly about their mental health. Michael Phelps was one of them, and also the editor of The Atlantic, I don't know if you know, Scott Stossel, came out with his best-selling book about anxiety. And he also was like, this is career suicide, everyone's going to turn against me, like I'm going to bring shame upon my family, and the world's going to end. Why do you think that suddenly 2019, or because it really is very recent to this stage, why is it getting more accepted, the idea that people can be both successful and also have mental health issues and concerns?
Well, I think that part of it is that be anxious is part of it, and I see almost a generational shift. So first of all, my father's a psychiatrist, so I grew up knowing, full stop, that everybody is crazy in one way or another. So we talked about it a lot, but over time I think you see that there is more of a movement in work to bring your whole self to work. I think that has an aspect to it. So I was reading an article recently about a woman whose mother was a journalist and never told anybody at work over like 20, 30 years that she had children. So, it's a different thing, right, that you have a family, but it's kind of the same thing. There was this sense that when you're at work, this is this person. You just do your work and the rest of it is completely separate. And I think that that's changing as, you know, as partly as work and your personal life blend together, and we work harder. But I just think more generally that people are ready to be more open with each other. And
you also talk a lot in your book about a work-life balance, and what were your thoughts that you outlined in that?
I just think it's really useful to play the long game in terms of work and life and integrating them. I don't really think that there is balance, and I think we kind of get a little bit even more anxious going, oh my God, do I have work-life balance? You know, is it 50-50? I think that what's been useful to me is thinking, oh, well, you know, I'm going to live a longer life and I'm going to make a lot of mistakes, and I have time for that. I have time for that, and I have time to recover from that and learn from that, and nothing's ever going to be perfect.
And so when the incident happened with your friend, and obviously that had a great effect on you, what were the main changes that you made with regard to living your life and your work-life balance?
I think that's the thing that amuses me a little bit, is that, you know, it was not instantaneous. Of course, what did I do when that happened? I just doubled down at my work to just forget about it, right? It wasn't like I had this, you know, aha moment and all of a sudden I rearranged everything. It took a lot of time to think about what I wanted. I looked for other jobs. I, you know, thought maybe I should start a company, you know, whatever. What would be better? But ultimately, I remember thinking that I did write a book. I wrote a children's book, actually, because that was one of the things that my friend and I had been talking about. You know, I was like, maybe I'm going to write a book for this or that, and then she'd be like, yeah, me too. Maybe I got all these maybes that we kept putting off. So that one I just did with like great speed, and that was my first way that I wanted to honor her. And then other things I did over years. Really, it took years to kind of process and think, maybe I need to live my life differently.
And was that decision to leave the rat race hard? I mean, like, how do you balance the safety of stability versus risk-taking opportunities and really make that decision to just leave your job?
I think that it's difficult partly because for me it had become so much of my identity. And I think that that happens if you stay in one place for a long time, but I also think it happens if you start to identify with yourself as an entrepreneur or, you know, a software engineer or whatever it is, and you want to do something different. It's so hard. And I think that we don't really give ourselves an opportunity to experiment. We don't give other people much of an opportunity. So that's the biggest issue. I was thinking, gosh, everybody used to say, oh, Diana, you have a lovely family and these kids, and you have this great job, and you have it all, right? So who am I if I don't have it all? Like, who's the new Diana going to be? Can't possibly be as good as the old Diana, even though she was not always that happy with all. So that was very difficult. And then, I mean, it's not necessarily, it may be unique to my own, but I really don't think so for you. Who's here is an entrepreneur? Raise your hand. Okay, interesting. I thought there'd be more, but structure, you know, wanting to actually prioritize my own personal things like my family or just exercising or writing or things that are personal that other people don't pat you on the back for. That was really hard, and it's still hard. So yeah, that, and being able to say, so what are you doing? And you're like, I don't know, I'm actually trying 4 things to see which one works. So
you laid out a lot of points in your book. One of them was that you think people should be experimenting more, right? That job hopping isn't such a bad thing. Could you expound a little bit on that point, and also were there any criticisms on that point from other people?
I think that, so to be fair, I've always had a short attention span, so it's not like I became this massive dilettante in late in life. I had that from early on. I have looked at so many resumes, and in particular in Hong Kong. I've been here for 20 years, and I remember having these conversations about hiring, a 25-year-old, and somebody would be like, they've had like 3 jobs, and I'm like, who cares? When you're 25, who wants to specialize at that age? So I do think that it's something that may be cultural, but at the same time, I think Hong Kong is the only place where you can pretty much talk yourself into many jobs based on your network, having no experience, which I've done a number of times. So I think that there's a book called 100-Year Life. For any of you who've have read it, it talks about the fact that you're going to be working now for 60 years, maybe longer. So yeah, I think that you should experiment. I'm not saying that you should, I don't think experimenting and job hopping are the same thing. I think it's like taking your ideas and using a minimum viable project approach or product approach to experiment. So there's a lot of themes with corporate innovation, like maybe I want to be a writer rather than quitting my job and going to, sign on to journalism school or whatever. Maybe I can try to write, start small, take a small bet, try to write 1 article, and then see how that goes. And maybe I hate it. There's been lots of things that I've done that nobody ever knows about because I tried it and I hated it, and over time I've learned not to tell everybody when I do things.
And you recently, I think, when all this was changing, you were teaching the Financial Times non-executive director's diploma. So in this room, probably a lot of 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds at the top of their game in all these banks. But your experience with them wasn't necessarily that they all thought it was like that they succeeded and it was done, and they were all sort of confused on what's next.
Yeah, I think that was sort of the clincher, having figured out that I didn't know what I was doing, and then basically being surrounded by these captains of industry who had, by every measure, succeeded. Monetarily, they all, had reached the C-suite. They were all super interesting and smart, and many of them were thinking, now what? And they kept like having coffee with me or saying like, Diana, what do you think I should do now? And I'm like, I don't know, like, you're asking me? But at the same time, I was going through some similar things to them in terms of, yeah, actually, we're gonna live longer. We wanna do things differently and on our own terms. And what could that look like? And so I just went and interviewed a number of people who were doing interesting things and asked them what they had done and combined that with some of the research to write the book.
So what are some of these guys doing afterwards?
So I think a lot of them, there's this perspective that you will know the messy. So the thing that I do like is some of them are, they're looking back and saying, oh, of course, that makes sense. This is why I did this, these disparate things. Like Brian Tang is now the founding director of HKU's LITE, I always mess it up, Legal Innovation, Technology and Entrepreneurship Center at the HKU Law School. And he did an Asia Capital Markets Institute, which was regulatory, and he did Technovation Changemakers for kids, and those couldn't be more disparate, but he ended up in the sort of crosshairs or a network of tech people and hackathons and regulatory that made him the perfect person for that job that at the time that he left as CEO of a big bank didn't exist. So you look at that and go, wow, how did he know that, and how could I do that too, and sort of forecast. I think you can't do that. And I interviewed a lot of people who are in the middle. Either they think they know what they might want to do, And so they're starting to experiment with, in small ways, developing their brand outside of their corporate, starting to be strategic about how they're building the next steps.
And what advice would you give to someone, you've mentioned a couple times about the sort of identity crisis, you know, you've been this for 25 years, you've been in this industry for 30 years, and that becomes something of their identity. What advice would you give to someone to get over it and just...
That's tough love. Get over it, yeah. I think it's time for reflection, which none of us really spend, and maybe some structured time for reflection. So first I was reading, I started writing this book, and you know, the idea of a small bet, like I'm not a writer. I didn't know if I could write a book. I didn't know if I could write anything. So I signed up with the Hong Kong Writers Circle, and I was with these two guys who were much better writers than I was, and I would bring my stuff every month, and they looked at some of the stuff for Future Proof and said, oh, could you make this good? But you know, people read this and go, okay, the state of the universe is accelerating change. God, what do I do now? So I find that it's not just get over it, but it is really taking the time to reflect and the space to think about what your values are. So in the book, and even in some of the worksheets that are online, there are questions about, okay, here's one way to approach it. Here's what things like Ikigai, or what I called finding your Ven, and what the Dilbert creator calls your best combo deal. What are the things that you do that combined together make you have a unique position? And also just values, and there are links to things like, you know, Strengths Finder, values, or purpose. There's a lot out there that is free that you can look at. And I personally spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, if I'm going to do this, basically it boils down to, what are the criteria I'm using to make decisions? And for me, it's learning. That was a big one. And contributing to a network and a community. And that informs and allows me to help make decisions. You asked me to come here. I feel like it strengthens our community. I'm happy to do that. And I'll learn something from you guys.
Do you just sort of start measuring your life and your decisions at times when you're considering changing, or is this something you actually do quite routinely?
I love to say I do it routinely, and I intend to do it routinely, but I do it pretty often. I try when I do, in fact, for our board piece, there's a learning log. So the intention that you think is going to be great, like I'm launching a course right now. So I'm launching a beta course. I'm going to try it. We have people that are signing up. We'll start in September. And it could be a total disaster. I don't think it will be, but after we do it, we'll reflect. And it's that kind of, it's time bound. I have certain ideas of what I want it to be. I'll ask people to tell me after, and and then if it's a disaster, I'll go do something else.
Are you really that flippant though with it? Are you really that okay with, something being a disaster?
Am I okay with disaster? I mean, no, of course. I think I'm more okay with specific disasters. I'm pretty good in a crisis. I'm less okay with that creeping feeling of despondency, like, that sense like, have I done anything this year? Oh my God. Like, is this really the right thing? I don't even know what I'm doing. That I have more trouble with. The general, like, maybe what I'm doing isn't right.
So before I hand it over to the audience here, what sort of advice would you give to someone who right now is maybe in the early stages of their career, or maybe 10 years down the line in their career, and just don't see the future in it, or are confused and just don't feel this is it, but are scared to make that change?
I think that was the interesting thing about both my TED Talk and this book, is that I would speak to people who, in my mind, this is a book for somebody like me, sort of mid-career, and yet so many say, oh yeah, I totally get this, after the TED Talk as well, where they're in their 20s and they already see it, right? Some of us are slow learners, but they already see that the investment may not pay off, and they're wondering what investment will pay off. And I think that thinking about it in terms of transferable skills, like what are the things that could help you no matter what your career will be. I think that having a practice of reflection and even an annual practice of setting learning goals, or reviewing the year and deciding what you want to do, or quarterly if you can, like having just investing in things like soft skills, like leadership, or I did an MBA course that was all on interpersonal dynamics, and a lot of people came up and said, I've never really thought about the fact that giving good feedback and receiving good feedback is a skill. And that's the kind of thing that I think will become more and more important for people, and that we overlook because we think, oh God, should I take like the MIT online course on AI or big data or to keep up? And just investing in just even your own self-care so that you can sustain yourself for a long time is really important.
And finally, what do you think the future of work looks like? Or what would you like the future of work to look like? You can choose which one you answer.
Well, nobody knows. Recently there was, the idea that automation will kill all these jobs, and there was somebody who put up a chart that had like the top 15 predictions from all these very prestigious sources. Every single one of them was different and, wildly different and divergent. So I don't think anybody knows, but what I like and what I've found for myself is that it allows people to live life more on their own terms. You have a longer lifespan, you have a longer period of work, so you can afford to take some time off. So for me, I'm working less than I used to, and I'm traveling less than I used to. And sometimes I'm terrified that means that I'm not doing the right thing, but then again, I have 3 kids, or at least I did when we started the talk, and but certainly I remind myself that in 10 years they'll be gone, and I can do these things in 10 years. I can ramp up in 10 years. I can go back to my workaholic ways in 10 years if I want. It's all possible, given this longer lifetime.
But are there companies that are making that possible, or do you really have to go it on your own and be that digital nomad, putting your fingers in as many pies and therefore owning your timetable?
Yes, I think that companies are really trying to do that. And I think that the onus is also on us to invest in understanding our boundaries and setting our boundaries, because I don't think that, for instance, McKinsey did a study on people who were leaving because of burnout, and companies are putting policies together that are to attract talent, and they think that they're doing a great thing. McKinsey looked and said, of the people who have just left for burnout, what percentage of them still have vacation days? How many do you think it was? 50? 100% of them had vacation days they hadn't taken. So part of what they've done, which is maybe unfair, is say, look guys, you're a part of this equation. And I can say from my own perspective, I didn't know how to do that when I was at work, and I learned through some great colleagues and mentorship, but I'm not good at setting boundaries on my work. And it's something that I think that we all have to do personally, but I think also as leaders and managers that people need to understand how to do that.
Thank you so much for answering my questions. We're going to take a 5-minute break. You've all actually got question cards on you, because the second part's all about you. We're going to pass out some pens for you to write down any questions you might have for Diana, and we'll reconvene in about 5 minutes' time when I'll read out all your questions. Thank you so much for sticking with us. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you.